Imagine a winter morning in December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes in Belgium are blanketed in snow, the air crisp and biting, and an uneasy silence hangs over the landscape. Yet beneath that quiet lies the tension of an approaching storm, a storm that will erupt into one of the most dramatic and desperate battles of the Second World War. This is the moment when Nazi Germany, cornered and on the brink of collapse, launches its final gamble on the Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge. For months, the Allies had been pushing relentlessly through France, liberated towns and cities falling under their control, while Germany's once mighty army struggled to regroup. Adolf Hitler, desperate to turn the tide of the war, hatched a bold and risky plan. He hoped to split the Allied forces, capture the crucial port city of Antwerp, and create enough chaos to force a fracture in the fragile alliance between American, British, and Canadian troops. If successful, it could buy Germany time to recover and perhaps even prolong the conflict, but the stakes were incredibly high, and the margin for error was almost non-existent. The Ardennes, a region known for its dense forests, winding roads, and harsh winter weather, was both a challenge and an opportunity. To the Allies, it seemed quiet and secure, a sector held by inexperienced or battle-weary American troops. To the Germans, it offered a chance for a surprise attack, exploiting the terrain and the element of winter to their advantage. Yet moving thousands of troops, tanks, and supplies through this frozen wilderness would test even the most disciplined armies. Fog, sleet, snow, and the shadowed forest canopy turned every step into a gamble, every decision into a potential life or death choice. This battle was not just about strategy and military might. It was about endurance, courage, and the human spirit. Soldiers on both sides would face freezing temperatures, relentless artillery fire, and the constant threat of ambush. Young men like Klaus Schultz, barely 17, were thrust into the heart of the conflict, carrying the weight of their nation's last hopes on shoulders, too young to bear such responsibility. Meanwhile, American troops, exhausted from months of fighting, had to quickly adapt to the sudden onslaught, holding positions and improvising under extreme pressure. Over the next several weeks, chaos and bravery would intertwine. Villages would become temporary battlegrounds. Forests would echo with the sounds of gunfire and movement, and individual acts of heroism would emerge amidst the struggle. The Battle of the Bulge was more than a military campaign, it was a test of resilience, strategy, and the will to survive against overwhelming odds. As we journey through this dramatic chapter of history, you will witness how plans can falter, how courage can shine, and how the smallest decisions can shape the outcome of entire nations. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth stories from the battlefields of history, where we uncover the human experiences behind the events that changed the world forever. The Ardennes is waiting, the stage is set, and the last gamble of the Third Reich is about to begin. As December 1944 descended upon Europe, the world stood at a precarious tipping point, with the Allied armies pressing ever closer to Germany's heartland, and the Third Reich teetering on the brink of collapse. Adolf Hitler, isolated in his fortified command bunkers, surveyed maps of the Western Front with a mixture of desperation and obsession, convinced that one final, audacious strike could somehow reverse the inexorable tide of the war. The Ardennes Forest, a seemingly quiet expanse of dense trees and winding roads in Belgium, became the stage for his last gamble, a high-stakes plan designed not only to split the Allied forces, but also to deliver a psychological shock intended to weaken the fragile coalition of American, British, and Canadian troops who had been advancing steadily across liberated Europe. Hitler imagined a dramatic breakthrough, a sharp wedge that would drive deep into the Allied lines, severing communication, disrupting supply chains, and forcing the Allied commanders into disarray, all while capturing the vital port city of Antwerp, whose harbours were essential for sustaining their logistical operations. In his, such a bold manoeuvre might sow enough fear, confusion, and mistrust to fracture the alliance and create an opening for Germany to recover and regroup, perhaps even reclaiming some semblance of power and pride in the face of overwhelming odds. From the perspective of the German soldiers, the plan held both promise and peril, for they understood that their leader's vision, though ambitious, was built on hope rather than realistic appraisal of the circumstances. Young recruits like Klaus Scholz, barely 17, were dispatched to the Ardennes with little time to prepare, their youthful faces concealing the anxiety and anticipation that rippled through every man assigned to this theatre of operations. The Ardennes was a forested labyrinth, its thick pine trees forming a natural canopy that cast long shadows even on bright days, while its narrow roads and icy paths posed serious obstacles for the tanks, artillery, and supply wagons essential to the success of any large-scale offensive. The terrain was familiar to some German units, who had fought here earlier in the war, but familiarity did not eliminate the difficulties posed by freezing temperatures, dense undergrowth, or sudden blizzards that could halt movement and obscure visibility. Every step forward demanded patience, cunning, and an unyielding determination, and yet the soldiers pressed on, acutely aware that the weight of the Reich's last hopes rested on their shoulders. For the Allies, the Ardennes appeared deceptively calm, a sector thinly defended by troops who were inexperienced, exhausted, or reassigned from quieter fronts after months of grueling campaigns in Normandy and France. American units were dispersed, supply lines stretched, and many commanders assumed that the dense forest and harsh winter weather made it unlikely that Germany would attempt any significant offensive here. That miscalculation would soon prove costly, as German forces moved under the cover of early morning fog and snow, launching coordinated strikes that cut through the Allied positions with surprising swiftness. The shock of the German advance was immediate. Soldiers found themselves isolated from their comrades, communication lines disrupted, and small towns and crossroads falling under enemy control. Villages that had seemed secure one moment were transformed into chaotic theatres of conflict the next, as both sides navigated the frozen forests and snow-laden fields while struggling to maintain order amidst the tumult. Hitler's strategy relied not only on brute force but also on deception. German troops, particularly those in the elite 150th Panzer Brigade, used captured American jeeps, uniforms, and identification tags to infiltrate Allied lines, creating confusion and slowing down organized resistance. The objective was precise: reach critical road networks, disrupt the Allies' ability to maneuver, and press onward toward Antwerp, where the capture of the port would threaten to sever the Allies' lifeline of supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements. Every advance was calculated to maximize psychological impact, demonstrating that the supposedly unstoppable Allied momentum could be checked, that German forces were still capable of audacious action, and that the alliance of nations working together against the Reich might not be as unshakable as it appeared. The Ardennes offensive was meant to combine the elements of surprise, tactical cunning, and the intimidating presence of panzer divisions to create both tangible and intangible effects, the former in the form of territorial gains, the latter in instilling fear and doubt in the minds of the Allied commanders and soldiers. Yet as the battle unfolded, the limitations of Hitler's plan became increasingly apparent. The dense forest, meant to conceal German movements, slowed the advance of tanks and mechanized units. Harsh winter conditions compounded the difficulties, making supply runs perilous and troop movements arduous. Fuel shortages, logistical delays, and overestimation of Allied vulnerabilities became critical obstacles that the German forces could not fully overcome. Meanwhile, American soldiers, despite initial confusion and the element of surprise favoring the attackers, began to regroup with remarkable resilience. Units that were initially isolated or overwhelmed adapted quickly, setting up defensive positions, improvising camouflage in the snow, and coordinating counterattacks with reinforcements brought in by General Patton's Third Army. The very forests that the Germans had counted on for stealth now hindered rapid movement and left them exposed to countermeasures by a determined and well-supplied enemy. Amid the broader strategic maneuvers, the human dimension of the Ardennes offensive became starkly apparent. Soldiers on both sides endured freezing temperatures, relentless artillery, and the ever-present threat of ambush, testing their physical limits and mental fortitude. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, towns and villages experiencing the sudden and brutal consequences of military operations. Stories emerged of acts of courage, ingenuity, and compassion alongside instances of horror and tragedy, painting a complex portrait of the war as both a human and strategic endeavor. The psychological stakes envisioned by Hitler, fear, confusion, and potential fractures within the Allied coalition met with the equally compelling psychological realities of exhaustion, perseverance, and the unyielding will to defend and survive. In the end, the Ardennes offensive, though initially promising in its audacity and design, could not achieve the grand objectives envisioned by its architect. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The anticipated collapse of the coalition never materialized, and German forces were gradually worn down by the combination of environmental challenges, logistical shortfalls, and the determined counteractions of the Allies. Yet within this story of strategic miscalculation and eventual defeat lies a deeper narrative about the interplay of ambition, human endurance, and the unforeseeable consequences of decisions made in desperation. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a testament to the extremes of warfare, illustrating how the weight of leadership decisions, the bravery of ordinary soldiers, and the unpredictable forces of nature intertwine to shape history in ways that continue to fascinate and instruct us even decades later. As the winter of 1944 deepened over the Ardennes, the stage was set for a dramatic and daring military maneuver that would become one of the most storied battles of the Second World War. A clash in which cunning, courage, and sheer desperation converged on the snow-blanketed forests of Belgium. Hitler's last gamble on the Western Front relied not simply on overwhelming force, but on a combination of audacious tactics, meticulous planning, and psychological warfare designed to catch the Allies off guard and exploit every conceivable advantage. Central to this strategy were the elements of surprise, the ingenious use of disguised vehicles, and the concentrated power of elite panzer divisions, each playing a critical role in the initial shock that would ripple through the thinly defended American lines. The Ardennes Forest itself, with its dense canopy of towering pines and its winding, icy roads, provided both cover and challenge for the advancing German troops. Here, the natural environment was as much a participant in the unfolding drama as any soldier or tank, casting long shadows that obscured movement and muffled sound. While narrow passages limited the speed of mechanized units, German commanders recognized that speed and surprise were essential, knowing that any delay could allow the Allies to reinforce their positions and neutralize the advantage of the initial strike. Early on the morning of December 16, 1944, under the veil of heavy fog and snowfall, the German offensive began with a sudden and intense bombardment designed to disorient and confuse the defenders, while panzer columns moved forward with precision, exploiting gaps in the American lines and aiming to seize critical crossroads and villages that would serve as gateways for further penetration. Disguise and deception became integral components of the German plan, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of both psychology and battlefield dynamics. The 150th Panzer Brigade, an elite armored unit, employed captured American jeeps, trucks, and even uniforms to infiltrate Allied positions, creating confusion and slowing coordinated counterattacks. Soldiers moving in familiar silhouettes, identification tags in hand, could blend seamlessly into the chaos, striking suddenly before vanishing into the forest or melting back into their own lines. This element of trickery was not merely theatrical. It was a calculated measure to maximize the disruptive impact on American units that were already struggling with inexperience. Exhaustion and the daunting terrain. Convoys would advance along icy roads, maneuvering cautiously to avoid detection while simultaneously using the appearance of normalcy to mask their little intent. The deceptive movements created a sense of uncertainty among the defenders, as familiar vehicles and seemingly friendly soldiers suddenly revealed themselves as threats, undermining morale and slowing the American response. Meanwhile, the concentrated power of panzer divisions lent a formidable weight to the offensive. Tanks, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery, spearheaded the advance, smashing through lightly defended positions and exploiting weak points along the road network. Yet the Ardennes, for all its strategic advantages, was far from ideal for mechanized warfare. The dense trees, narrow roads, and icy terrain slowed the tanks' movement, while fog and snowfall limited visibility and coordination. German commanders relied on careful planning and timing to mitigate these obstacles, coordinating infantry and armor in combined arms tactics that allowed for penetration of the Allied defenses while maintaining momentum. Every successful maneuver brought them closer to strategic objectives, from the capture of towns and bridges to the disruption of supply lines critical for the Allied war effort. As the offensive unfolded, the psychological impact of surprise and deception became increasingly evident. American soldiers awoke to the sound of explosions and gunfire in areas they had assumed were quiet, encountering units that seemed to materialize from nowhere, vehicles that appeared familiar but carried hostile intent, and tanks rolling forward in unexpected directions. Initial confusion slowed the establishment of defensive lines, and many positions were temporarily isolated or overrun, creating a sense of vulnerability and urgency. The Germans had hoped that the rapid advances and clever use of disguises would not only yield tactical gains but also force the Allies into errors of judgment, potentially creating fractures in command and leaving key positions open to exploitation. Civilians, too, were caught up in the shock of the offensive, with towns and villages suddenly transformed into battlefields, leaving communities to navigate the sudden chaos and violence that enveloped their homes. Yet as the days wore on, the limitations of even the most carefully orchestrated plan began to surface. The forests, which had initially concealed German movements, increasingly hindered the rapid advance of tanks and mechanized infantry. Supply lines became overextended, fuel shortages slowed the armored columns, and the harsh winter conditions made every maneuver arduous, testing the stamina and resolve of the soldiers. American forces, despite the initial surprise, adapted quickly, organizing counterattacks, reinforcing threatened sectors, and utilizing artillery and air support whenever the weather allowed. The psychological shock, while significant, could not compensate for the logistical and environmental challenges that German commanders faced, and the offensive gradually lost momentum as resistance stiffened, and the strategic realities of the Ardennes imposed themselves upon the ambitious plan. Throughout the battle, the human dimension remained at the forefront, illustrating the intense interplay between strategy, improvisation, and endurance. Soldiers on both sides faced freezing temperatures, exhaustion, and the constant threat of ambush, their actions shaped by split-second decisions, a mix of fear and courage. and the sheer will to survive. Stories of heroism emerged alongside acts of cunning and clever adaptation, as both German and Allied troops learned to navigate the complexities of a battlefield defined by concealment, deception, and the relentless advance of mechanized power. The combination of surprise attacks, disguised vehicles, and concentrated panzer divisions created a dynamic and unpredictable conflict, one that would leave lasting marks on the landscape. The soldiers and the historical record. Ultimately, while the initial successes of the German offensive demonstrated the potential power of strategy and deception, the broader constraints of terrain, weather, logistics, and Allied resilience limited the lasting impact of these tactics. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a compelling example of how innovation and audacity can shape the course of conflict, but also how even the most daring plans must contend with the immutable realities of supply, environment, and human endurance. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the dramatic interplay of surprise, disguise, and armored force created a battle that remains vivid in the annals of history, a testament to both the ingenuity and the limits of wartime strategy, and a story that continues to captivate those who study the extremes of human courage and conflict. As the icy grip of winter tightened across the Ardennes in mid-December 1944, the stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary in the annals of the Second World War, a collision of strategy, courage, and the unforgiving realities of combat. The dense forests of the Ardennes, with their towering pines casting long shadows over snow-covered roads, seemed tranquil at first glance, yet beneath that calm lay a vulnerability that the German High Command was quick to exploit. The sector was manned primarily by American forces who, despite their dedication, faced severe challenges. Many units were inexperienced, having been recently deployed after months of grueling campaigns in Normandy and France, while others were wary, exhausted from continuous combat operations, and struggling to adjust to the harsh conditions and unfamiliar terrain. The Germans recognized this opportunity immediately, understanding that the combination of the Allies' stretched lines, the thinly held defenses, and the daunting natural obstacles of the Ardennes provided a window for a potentially decisive strike. The early hours of December 16th brought a sudden eruption of violence that shattered the fragile calm. German troops, moving under the cover of dense fog and falling snow, launched a coordinated offensive that capitalized on the inexperience and fatigue of the American defenders. Panzer divisions spearheaded the advance, supported by mechanized infantry, while artillery barrages and mortars targeted key positions, sowing confusion and forcing hurried decisions among the defenders. Young soldiers, some barely out of training, found themselves facing seasoned German units executing a meticulously planned assault, their nerves fraying under the dual pressures of surprise and environmental adversity. Roads that might have facilitated rapid reinforcement or retreat were narrow and easily monitored by the attackers, leaving American units struggling to maneuver effectively under fire. The initial shock of the offensive gave the Germans a critical, albeit temporary, advantage, allowing them to seize towns, crossroads, and vital infrastructure before the Allies could fully organize a coordinated response. The human element of this advantage became immediately evident in the chaos that engulfed small villages and outposts throughout the Ardennes. Soldiers were forced to adapt quickly, improvising defensive positions, coordinating with nearby units despite disrupted communications, and confronting the psychological strain of facing an enemy who seemed to materialize from the forest itself. The German forces, skilled in the art of infiltration and deception, exploited this disorientation, using captured American vehicles and uniforms to further blur the lines between friend and foe, intensifying the uncertainty and delaying organized countermeasures. Every hour the Germans advanced, the Allies were compelled to respond under duress, reinforcing positions piecemeal and often leaving gaps that the attackers could exploit. Snow limited visibility, transforming even familiar roads and fields into treacherous avenues where one misstep could result in isolation or ambush, further amplifying the temporary advantage gained through the thin defenses and inexperience of the U.S. troops. Yet the story of the Ardennes offensive is not one of unmitigated German success. For the Americans, despite their initial setbacks, demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Units that had been caught off guard began to regroup, using local terrain to establish defensive strongpoints, coordinating artillery fire, and improvising communication lines to maintain contact with higher command. The cold, snow, and dense forests, while initially advantageous to the German advance, soon imposed severe logistical and operational challenges, slowing armored columns and complicating the movement of supplies, fuel, and reinforcements. Young American soldiers, many facing combat for the first time under extreme winter conditions, displayed extraordinary courage, holding positions under relentless pressure, rescuing wounded comrades, and finding innovative ways to counter the combined tactics of deception, armor, and concentrated assault employed by the Germans. Throughout the unfolding battle, the Ardennes itself seemed to take on a life of its own, shaping every maneuver and influencing every decision. Narrow passes and frozen rivers channeled troops along predictable routes, while thick forests provided cover for both attackers and defenders, creating a dynamic environment in which adaptability was as crucial as raw firepower. The Germans' temporary advantage derived not solely from the inexperience of the U.S. troops but from a perfect confluence of timing, terrain, and tactical innovation. Yet it also depended on sustaining momentum before the Allies could exploit their own resources. Experience and capacity for rapid adaptation. Villages change hands multiple times. Snow-covered roads bore the tracks of tanks and infantry alike, and soldiers on both sides endured freezing nights, relentless artillery fire, and the constant psychological toll of uncertainty and danger. The Ardennes offensive illustrates vividly how a temporary advantage in warfare can arise from a combination of human factors. Environmental conditions and strategic foresight. German commanders capitalized on the apparent weaknesses of the thinly held American sector, launching surprise attacks that leveraged both the inexperience and exhaustion of the defenders, while also exploiting the terrain to enhance the effectiveness of their armored and mechanized forces. Yet the fluidity of the battlefield, the resilience of the troops under pressure, and the capacity of both sides to adapt rapidly to unseen circumstances demonstrated that advantage in war is rarely permanent. As the days of combat wore on, the initial successes of the German offensive began to erode under the combined effects of logistical strain, determined resistance, and the harsh winter environment, ultimately illustrating the fragile and fleeting nature of opportunity in the midst of conflict. In the end, the Ardennes campaign serves as a compelling narrative about the interplay between preparedness, opportunity, and human endurance. The temporary advantage enjoyed by German forces, while significant in the early stages, was always contingent upon a precarious balance of speed, deception, and discipline, a balance constantly threatened by the realities of the battlefield and the indomitable spirit of those tasked with defending their positions. The story of inexperienced and exhausted use. Troops facing a well-coordinated and audacious offensive highlights both the vulnerability and resilience inherent in military operations, reminding us that in the crucible of war, every decision, every act of courage, and every adaptation to circumstance can shape the course of history in profound and unexpected ways. The Ardennes Forest in the winter of 1944 presented a battlefield that was as merciless as it was strategically significant. its towering pines and labyrinthine terrain shaping the fortunes of both attackers and defenders in ways that no general's plan could fully anticipate. From the first moment the German offensive began, it became clear that the environment itself would become a formidable adversary, imposing constraints that challenged mobility, communication, and the very execution of strategy on both sides. Snow blanketed the forest floor, turning narrow paths into slippery channels where tanks, jeeps, and trucks struggled to maintain traction, while deep drifts blocked passages and slowed the advance of infantry, forcing soldiers to wade through freezing cold with every step a struggle. Fog and sleet clung to the trees, limiting visibility to mere yards and masking movements until they were nearly upon the enemy, creating both the opportunity for surprise and the constant danger of misidentifying friend and foe in a deadly game of shadows. The forest's density magnified the difficulty of coordination and maneuver, turning even routine orders into complex logistical challenges. Roads, scarce and often wending, funneled units into predictable routes that could easily be ambushed, while alternative paths were impeded by fallen trees, frozen streams, or thick underbrush, making flanking maneuvers and rapid redeployment nearly impossible. German commanders, despite meticulous planning, found their panzer divisions slowed to a crawl, armored columns jostling for position along narrow lanes and frequently losing momentum when vehicles became stuck or had to navigate tight turns under enemy fire. Similarly, American troops, already stretched thin and exhausted from previous campaigns, had to adapt quickly, improvising defenses along these same constrained routes, using the forest itself as cover while balancing the need to maintain communication and provide mutual support across fragmented units. The terrain amplified the stakes of every decision. A single miscalculation in timing, positioning, or coordination could expose a unit to envelopment, cut it off from reinforcements, or leave it vulnerable to concentrated artillery strikes. Weather compounded these challenges, turning the Ardennes from a strategic opportunity into a testing ground of endurance and ingenuity. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, frosting weapons and numbing fingers, while continuous snowfall obscured landmarks and made navigation perilous. Soldiers on both sides faced the relentless physical toll of cold, wet clothing, and icy footing, each march or advance sapping strength and morale even before encountering enemy fire. Rain and sleet alternated with periods of dense fog, grounding aircraft and limiting reconnaissance, which in turn forced commanders to rely on limited and often outdated intelligence, increasing the uncertainty of every movement. Even when units managed to advance, frozen ground made digging trenches or constructing defensive positions laborious, and snow-laden trees could collapse under their weight, crushing equipment or blocking essential paths. The forest, cloaked in white, became a deceptive landscape in which distance and direction were distorted, and both sides had to learn quickly that conventional assumptions about maneuver and cover might no longer hold true. The narrow roads and treacherous terrain also had a profound impact on supply lines, a lifeline for both the advancing Germans and the beleaguered Americans. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to be transported over routes that could easily become clogged or destroyed, and the relentless winter conditions slowed resupply to the front lines, forcing units to ration and adapt in ways that tested ingenuity and discipline. For the Germans, this meant that even the well-coordinated panzer divisions, capable of devastating attacks on open ground, were constrained by the difficulty of moving sufficient fuel and ammunition through the frozen, forested lanes. For the Americans, whose units were often newly deployed and thinly spread, the challenge of supplying men and material across this unforgiving landscape created a constant tension between defensive necessity and operational flexibility, as commanders weighed the risks of moving reserves along vulnerable roads against the imperative to reinforce threatened positions. The interplay of terrain, weather, and infrastructure shaped the tactical decisions that defined the Ardennes campaign. Ambushes became a regular feature of the fighting, with units exploiting the forest concealment to strike unexpectedly, only to find their own movements slowed by the same conditions. Artillery and tank support were limited by the lack of open firing lanes, requiring careful positioning and coordination to avoid friendly fire or wasted firepower, while infantry often had to operate in fragmented sections, advancing through woods where visibility was so restricted that contact between neighboring squads could be lost within minutes. Soldiers learned to move in pairs or small teams, listening for the slightest sounds that might signal enemy movement, all the while contending with fatigue, hunger, and the cold that gnawed at both body and spirit. Every tactical innovation was influenced by the forest itself, from the use of improvised camouflage and snow-covered foxholes to the careful timing of attacks under the cover of fog and snowfall. Yet, despite these obstacles, the forest also offered opportunities for those who could read its complexities. German forces initially gained a temporary advantage by leveraging the concealment and confusion that the dense Ardennes provided, striking unexpectedly at inexperienced or exhausted American units and exploiting gaps in defensive lines. Similarly, American soldiers learned to turn the forest into an ally, establishing hidden positions, using natural cover for reconnaissance, and setting ambushes that slowed and harassed the advancing panzers. The harsh winter, though debilitating, created a shared reality that tested leadership, coordination, and courage, revealing both the resilience and adaptability of soldiers on both sides. The Ardennes campaign thus became not just a battle of firepower and numbers, but a battle of environment and endurance, where the snow-laden forest, freezing temperatures, and narrow, treacherous roads shaped every decision, every maneuver, and every moment of human drama. In the end, the dense Ardennes Forest and its winter conditions became a defining character in the story of the Battle of the Bulge, influencing the ebb and flow of combat and the fortunes of the armies engaged within it. The Germans' initial gains, derived in part from the element of surprise and the forest's concealment, were tempered by the same terrain that slowed their movements and exposed the vulnerabilities of extended supply lines. The Americans' eventual resilience and counterattack were similarly shaped by the ability to adapt to, rather than be overwhelmed by, the environment. This interplay of natural obstacles and human determination underscores the complexity of the Ardennes campaign, revealing that in war, as in luck, success is often dictated as much by the forces of nature and circumstance as by strategy, tactics, and courage, and that the frozen forests of Belgium would forever remain etched in history as both adversary and stage for one of World War II's most dramatic confrontations. As the German offensive surged into the Ardennes, the initial advances sent shockwaves through the thinly held Allied lines, creating a cascade of confusion and disarray that reverberated from the front lines deep into the command structures of both the American and British forces. The rapidity and audacity of the assault caught many units completely unprepared, as snow-covered roads funneled troops into vulnerable positions and dense forests masked the movement of enemy forces until it was often too late to respond effectively. American soldiers, some newly arrived and others fatigued from months of combat, found themselves facing an enemy who had not only studied the terrain but also exploited every weakness in their deployment, striking where defenses were minimal and communications fragile. Entire outposts were cut off from one another, isolated by a combination of rapidly advancing German troops and the natural obstacles of the Ardennes, leaving soldiers to make split-second decisions under the pressure of incoming artillery fire, mortars, and the eerie silence of snow-laden woods that seemed to hide movement at every turn. The human cost of these early advances quickly became apparent, as units found themselves encircled or forced to withdraw under fire, leaving positions and vital roads temporarily in German hands. In villages and small towns along the route of the offensive, civilians were caught in the maelstrom, their lives disrupted and often endangered as combat erupted around homes, schools, and churches. Snow, which could have offered some cover, instead amplified vulnerability, slowing evacuations and making it difficult to carry the wounded to safety, while artillery bombardments reduced buildings to rubble, leaving families without shelter and communities scarred by destruction. Accounts from survivors recount the terror of being trapped within homes as shells fell, the confusion of trying to navigate streets suddenly occupied by enemy troops, and the uncertainty of whether surrender, flight, or concealment offered the best chance for survival. The psychological impact on both soldiers and civilians was immense. The suddenness of the assault, coupled with the inability to predict where danger would strike next, created a pervasive sense of vulnerability and fear that lingered long after the first day of the offensive. For the soldiers engaged in these early confrontations, the chaos of the battlefield demanded an extraordinary combination of adaptability, courage, and resourcefulness. Young American troops, often barely acclimated to combat conditions, were thrust into situations where their training collided with the unpredictability of real battle. Unit cohesion was tested to the limit as soldiers improvised defensive positions in buildings, forests, and snow-covered fields, using whatever cover and weaponry was available to delay the German advance. Orders from higher command were sometimes delayed or disrupted, forcing junior officers and NCOs to make critical decisions with limited information, balancing the immediate need to protect lives against the strategic imperatives of holding key routes and preventing deeper penetration into Allied lines. The Germans, meanwhile, exploited every opportunity presented by the terrain and their element of surprise, advancing rapidly through isolated gaps and concentrating forces on positions where resistance was weakest, all while maintaining coordination under the difficult conditions of winter and forested terrain. The effect of these initial advances was to temporarily fracture the Allied defensive network, producing a series of localized crises in which units had to fend for themselves until reinforcements could arrive. Roads once assumed secure became contested avenues, villages became battlefields, and communication lines were frequently severed, leaving field commanders to rely on visual signals, couriers, and improvised methods to coordinate with neighboring units. In some instances, soldiers found themselves cut off for hours or even days, forced to ration supplies, care for the wounded, and maintain defensive positions under constant threat, while the broader strategic picture remained uncertain. These conditions magnified both the physical and emotional toll of combat, as the relentless pace of engagement, the harshness of the winter, and the ever-present risk of friendly fire created a sense of exhaustion and heightened vulnerability, testing the mettle of every individual involved. Civilian suffering, though often overlooked in strategic analysis, became a central and tragic feature of the Ardennes offensive. Towns like Malmedy and smaller hamlets saw civilians caught between retreating Allied forces and the rapidly advancing Germans, sometimes witnessing atrocities committed in the chaos of battle. The infamous Malmedy massacre, in which captured American prisoners were executed, stands as a stark illustration of the intersection of confusion, rapid advances, and human cruelty in the early days of the offensive. Yet countless smaller incidents, shootings, forced evacuations, and collateral damage from artillery and small arms fire added layers of tragedy that compounded the hardships faced by soldiers and civilians alike. These early days of the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that the advantages gained by rapid, surprise movements could carry devastating consequences, turning the tactical gains of a military offensive into a theater of human suffering where courage, endurance, and moral choice were tested alongside strategy and firepower. The initial German advances also set the tone for the struggle that would follow, as isolated pockets of resistance became rallying points for counterattacks, and the temporary disarray of Allied units prompted rapid adjustments in deployment, coordination, and logistics. Soldiers learned to adapt to fractured lines, employing small unit tactics, improvisation, and careful reconnaissance to regain lost ground and re-establish defensive cohesion. The interplay between the initial chaos and the measured responses it elicited illustrates the dynamic and unpredictable nature of warfare, particularly under the compounded stresses of winter. Forested terrain and the fog of surprise. As the offensive pressed on, the lessons of those early, disorienting days about the costs of confusion, the value of initiative, and the vulnerability of civilians caught in the crossfire shaped both immediate tactical decisions and the broader strategic understanding of the Ardennes campaign. Ultimately, the initial advances during the Ardennes offensive highlight the fragile balance between momentum and sustainability in warfare. German troops gained temporary advantage through speed, surprise, and exploitation of thin defenses. Yet every gain came at a human cost, as both soldiers and civilians bore the brunt of sudden, chaotic combat. The confusion that ensued, the isolated positions, and the tragic losses underscored the harsh realities of a battlefield where planning and strategy collided with uncertainty, terrain, and human endurance. In the unfolding story of the Battle of the Bulge, these early days remind us that the consequences of surprise and rapid advances extend far beyond tactical considerations, leaving an indelible mark on the lives of those caught in the maelstrom of history, shaping the narrative of courage, suffering, and the relentless drive to endure in the face of overwhelming odds. As the German forces pressed deeper into the Ardennes, exploiting gaps and creating a palpable sense of crisis among the Allied lines, a shift began to emerge that would ultimately turn the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. And it came not from a single decisive engagement but from the coordinated efforts of reinforcements, the remarkable leadership of General Georges Patton, and the resumption of Allied air superiority that had been temporarily grounded by the harsh winter weather. In the early days of the offensive, the snow-laden forests and narrow, treacherous roads had slowed movement, fragmented units, and amplified the chaos wrought by the German advance. Yet these same obstacles that had initially favored the attackers now became the stage on which the Allies' resilience, strategic acumen, and ability to adapt under pressure were tested and ultimately demonstrated. As reports of isolated units, cut-off positions, and urgent requests for support filtered up the chain of command, the Allied leadership recognized the critical necessity of swift and decisive action to prevent the German offensive from achieving its intended objectives. And it was in this context that Patton's rapid maneuvers became both a symbol and a practical instrument of renewed momentum. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, understood the strategic importance of the Ardennes corridor not only as a pathway for German forces toward Antwerp, but also as the keystone upon which the cohesion of Allied lines depended. Moving with a combination of speed, audacity, and meticulous coordination, he redirected units that had been poised for other objectives, orchestrating a series of rapid advances that capitalized on gaps in German logistics and took advantage of the very terrain that had initially hampered movement. The narrow roads, snow-covered fields, and dense woods that had impeded German tanks and trucks were now being navigated by reinforcements familiar with both the landscape and the necessity of timing and precision, turning natural obstacles into tactical advantages. Infantry, armored units, and artillery moved in concert, often under grueling conditions, to link up with beleaguered units, stabilize defensive lines, and create pockets of resistance capable of blunting German advances and eventually regaining lost ground. air superiority, long a decisive factor in Allied operations, also returned with renewed impact once the weather cleared, transforming the battlefield from one dominated by ground-level maneuver and forested concealment into a theater where reconnaissance, supply drops, and precision strikes could decisively influence the course of the conflict. Fighter bombers patrolled skies that had been shrouded in fog, identifying German concentrations, disrupting supply convoys, and providing close air support to embattled units on the ground. These aerial operations not only inflicted material losses on German forces, but also provided an essential morale boost to Allied troops, who had endured days of isolation, uncertainty, and the fear that the German offensive might succeed in splitting the lines and forcing withdrawals. The combination of Patton's ground movements and the restored presence of air power created a synergy that counteracted the initial advantages gained by the Germans, allowing the Allies to consolidate positions, reinforce vulnerable sectors, and systematically reclaim territory lost during the first days of the assault. Reinforcements played a pivotal role in this process, as units from other sectors, previously held in reserve or redeployed from quieter fronts, were rushed into the Ardennes under the coordination of higher command. Soldiers who had arrived tired and weary were quickly integrated into existing defensive networks, often learning to operate under the extreme conditions of winter warfare while coordinating with units that had already been engaged in combat for days. Artillery batteries were repositioned to cover vital crossroads and choke points. Engineers cleared roads and repaired damaged bridges, and infantry units established blocking positions to slow German advances. The arrival of these reinforcements not only restored numerical strength to the Allied lines, but also enhanced the psychological resilience of soldiers who, having witnessed the rapid German advance and the vulnerability of isolated outposts, could now see a path toward stabilizing the situation and regaining initiative. One of the most dramatic examples of Patton's leadership was his ability to anticipate the unfolding operational picture, to predict where German momentum might falter, and to direct mobile units into these key areas with remarkable speed. Utilizing intelligence gathered from reconnaissance and reports from frontline units, he orchestrated a series of counter-movements that leveraged both terrain and timing to disrupt German concentrations, threaten flanks, and relieve pressure on critical towns and road networks. Tanks and mechanized infantry, moving in coordinated formations, were able to exploit openings that had emerged due to German overextension or logistical strain, striking with a combination of firepower and mobility that the attackers had not anticipated. These maneuvers demonstrated not only the technical mastery of modern combined arms operations, but also the psychological dimension of warfare, as the sudden arrival of fresh, well-coordinated forces created confusion and doubt among German commanders already grappling with adverse terrain. Supply challenges, and the ever-present pressure of winter conditions. Air operations complemented these movements in both offensive and defensive capacities. Close air support targeted German artillery positions and columns of advancing tanks, slowing the pace of attacks and inflicting critical losses, while supply drops ensured that frontline units were provisioned with ammunition, food, and medical supplies that might otherwise have been impossible to transport over snowbound roads. Reconnaissance flights revealed weak points in German positions, allowing Patton and other commanders to allocate forces precisely where they could have the greatest impact, reducing the risk of further disarray and enhancing the coordination of counterattacks. The combined effect of reinforcements, rapid mechanized maneuvers, and air support shifted the initiative back into Allied hands, transforming the Ardennes from a theater of defensive desperation into a battleground where momentum could be regained and pressed against an overstretched opponent. As the Allies reasserted themselves, the consequences of the German offensive's early successes became increasingly evident. Units that had been isolated were linked back into the chain of command. Towns and road networks were reclaimed, and the flow of supplies and reinforcements stabilized positions that had been precarious just days earlier. The psychological impact was equally profound. Soldiers, who had endured confusion, fear, and the threat of encirclement, now recognized that the tide was turning, their confidence restored by visible evidence of coordinated strategy. The arrival of fresh forces, and the unmistakable presence of Allied aircraft dominating the skies. The Battle of the Bulge, while still fiercely contested, now entered a phase in which German momentum was checked. Casualties mounted, and the prospects for a decisive breakthrough faded in the face of adaptive, resilient, and coordinated Allied action. In essence, the arrival of reinforcements, the extraordinary leadership of General Patton, and the restored air superiority collectively served as the keystone of the Allied resurgence in the Ardennes, demonstrating that even in the face of surprise, adverse terrain, and harsh winter conditions, adaptability, coordination, and rapid exploitation of opportunities could reverse the fortunes of a seemingly desperate situation. These elements transformed the narrative of the battle from one of potential catastrophe into a story of resilience, strategic mastery, and the inexorable capacity of a determined force to regain initiative, proving that even under the most challenging conditions, skillful leadership and well-coordinated action could tip the scales in favor of those who refused to yield. As the Battle of the Bulge dragged on into late December, the initial shock and disorientation caused by the German offensive began to give way to the harsh realities of warfare under extreme conditions, and the momentum that had once seemed unstoppable started to falter under the combined weight of exhaustion, logistical difficulties, and the overwhelming resources of the Allied forces. German troops, who had advanced rapidly through the snow-covered Ardennes, pushing through thinly defended positions and exploiting every temporary gap in the Allied lines, were beginning to feel the cumulative effects of relentless fighting. Bitter cold and supply shortages, the dense forests that had provided concealment and tactical advantage during the opening days now became obstacles that slowed movement. A complicated coordination, and exposed units to the increasing threat of counterattack, and the very element of surprise that had made their early gains so formidable was eroding as the Allies adapted to the unexpected assault. Soldiers who had marched and fought for days without adequate rest, food, or ammunition found themselves facing not only enemy fire, but the crushing demands of sustaining operations in an environment where every road, every ridge, and every village had become a contested space, and where mechanical failures of tanks, trucks, and artillery increasingly compounded the strain. Logistical challenges soon emerged as a decisive factor, exposing the limits of the German army's ambitious plans. Fuel, a resource critical to maintaining the mobility of panzer divisions and mechanized units, was in critically short supply, and the overextended supply lines could not keep pace with the rapid advances the initial plan had demanded. Roads clogged with vehicles, many of them immobilized by snow or mechanical breakdown, prevented the steady flow of reinforcements and material, and the Germans found themselves unable to sustain the tempo of attacks necessary to achieve their objectives, particularly the ambitious goal of reaching Antwerp and disrupting Allied supply networks. Meanwhile, the Allied forces, having stabilized critical sectors and reorganized under the leadership of commanders like General Patton, were able to leverage their superior logistical infrastructure. Moving tanks, artillery, ammunition, and fresh troops along well-maintained routes and through a command system capable of coordinating complex operations, even under difficult conditions. The contrast between the strained, improvised German supply efforts and the methodical, Well-supported Allied operations highlighted a fundamental asymmetry that would increasingly dictate the course of the battle. The human toll of these challenges was evident in the exhaustion and morale of German units. Soldiers who had entered the Ardennes with the fervor of a last-ditch offensive found themselves enduring freezing temperatures, snow, sleet, and intermittent storms, often while operating without adequate clothing or shelter. Casualties from the early fighting, combined with frostbite, illness, and the psychological strain of constant engagement, sapped the effectiveness of units already stretched thin, and leaders at every level were forced to make impossible decisions about where to concentrate forces, when to advance, and how to preserve what remained of their combat power. Despite the initial brilliance of the plan, the reality of attrition, weather, and Allied resistance began to impose an unavoidable slowdown, as German forces struggled to maintain cohesion and combat effectiveness in the face of mounting obstacles. Small-scale engagements that had seemed easily manageable in the opening days became protracted. Costly confrontations. With units unable to maneuver quickly enough to exploit temporary successes and increasingly vulnerable to counterattacks from troops now reinforced and resupplied by the Allies. By contrast, Allied forces were able to capitalize on their advantages in manpower, firepower, and operational flexibility. Reinforcements that had been rushed into critical sectors, combined with Patton's rapid and decisive movements, ensured that the German advance could not continue unchecked, and air support, once the weather cleared, allowed Allied commanders to strike supply depots. Troop concentrations, and retreating units with precision and devastating effect. The ability to coordinate artillery barrages, infantry maneuvers, and armored thrusts in response to German movements turned the once threatening momentum of the offensive into a series of localized defensive victories that eroded the strategic initiative of the attackers. Even as German soldiers fought with determination and skill, the cumulative impact of exhaustion, logistical shortfalls, and sustained Allied countermeasures made further progress increasingly improbable, and the once hopeful plans for encircling Allied forces and capturing critical objectives began to unravel in real time. The geography of the Ardennes itself contributed to the stalling of the offensive. Narrow roads and heavily forested terrain slowed the movement of heavy armor and supply convoys, creating bottlenecks that Allied forces could exploit through targeted strikes and interdiction. Hills and ridges, which had initially offered the Germans cover and strategic advantage, now became defensive positions for the Allies, allowing smaller forces to hold key terrain and deny access to critical routes. Villages, which had been the sites of initial chaos and civilian suffering, were now fortified positions for Allied troops, who used local knowledge, improvised defenses, and combined arms coordination to blunt German advances. The interaction between terrain, weather, and logistics created a compounding effect, amplifying the consequences of each small setback and making it increasingly clear that the ambitious goals of the German offensive were no longer achievable. In addition to physical and operational challenges, the psychological impact on German commanders and soldiers further contributed to the stalling of the offensive. The failure to maintain the pace of the advance, the inability to secure key objectives on schedule, and the growing realization that Allied forces could and would respond with overwhelming force created tension, uncertainty, and a creeping sense of inevitability. Orders issued from high command increasingly conflicted with the practical realities on the ground, and local leaders were forced to improvise under extreme pressure, often making decisions that addressed immediate threats but failed to align with the original strategic intent. Meanwhile, Allied morale strengthened as soldiers observed the arrival of reinforcements, the coordination of counterattacks, and the growing effectiveness of combined arms operations. Each recovered village, Each cleared road, and each successful defensive action reinforced confidence and set the stage for the eventual turning of the tide. By late December, the German offensive, which had begun with daring ambition and a temporary advantage, had lost nearly all momentum. Exhaustion. Logistical shortfalls, overextended supply lines, and the overwhelming resources and resilience of the Allies combined to halt further advances, leaving German units vulnerable to counterattack and attrition. The Ardennes, once a corridor of opportunity for a last-ditch gamble, had become a landscape of stalled tanks, frozen supply vehicles, and exhausted soldiers, while Allied forces consolidated their positions, reinforced weak points, and prepared for the final push that would decisively repel the German threat. The stalling of the offensive not only marked a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge, but also underscored the enduring principles of modern warfare: the necessity of logistics, the inevitability of attrition, and the decisive role of coordinated strategy in determining the outcome of even the most audacious military operations. It was in this convergence of exhaustion, resource disparity, and resilient opposition that the German gamble met its limits, demonstrating that initial success, no matter how spectacular, can never substitute for sustained operational capacity, planning, and the adaptability of a determined opponent. As the frost of late December and the first weeks of January settled over the Ardennes, the full cost of Hitler's last gamble became painfully evident, with the staggering scale of human and material loss marking the battle as one of the bloodiest and most desperate engagements of the Second World War, and the story of survival, courage, and resilience on both sides unfolded against a backdrop of relentless winter warfare. Dense forests and frozen roads that had already tested the limits of every soldier's endurance. German forces, initially imbued with confidence, surprise, and determination to strike a decisive blow against the Allied lines, found themselves increasingly unable to sustain the momentum that had carried them through the first chaotic days of the offensive, and the stark realities of attrition. Exhaustion and Allied countermeasures rapidly transformed their ambition into a grim struggle for survival. Over 100,000 German troops were killed, wounded, or captured during the course of the battle, a staggering toll that reflected both the ferocity of the fighting and the vulnerabilities inherent in launching a major offensive with limited resources against a numerically and logistically superior enemy. And the destruction of 2/3 of their armored vehicles further eroded the operational capability of the Wehrmacht, leaving divisions immobilized, fragmented, and unable to achieve the strategic objectives that had been envisioned in Hitler's high-risk plan. The Allied response, forged through a combination of reinforcements, rapid mechanized maneuvers, and the renewed application of air power, steadily reversed the temporary gains achieved by the German assault. Units that had initially been isolated or pushed back by surprise attacks were gradually linked into cohesive defensive and counteroffensive positions, while General Patton's Third Army executed a series of coordinated maneuvers that exploited weaknesses in German dispositions, reinforced vulnerable sectors, and enabled a methodical, relentless reclamation of territory that had once seemed on the brink of collapse. As fresh troops arrived from adjacent sectors, artillery and armor were redeployed to maximize coverage of key crossroads, bridges, and defensive terrain, and reconnaissance flights provided real-time intelligence that allowed Allied commanders to anticipate movements, disrupt supply lines, and launch targeted strikes against exposed units. The cumulative effect of these coordinated efforts created a dynamic in which German advances were slowed, then halted, and eventually reversed, with the psychological impact on both sides becoming increasingly pronounced as the once confident attackers faced mounting casualties. Dwindling supplies and the realization that their initial successes could not be consolidated into meaningful strategic outcomes. The winter environment of the Ardennes, which had played such a decisive role in the early confusion and disorder, now became both a stage and a witness to the inexorable grinding down of German forces. Snow-laden forests, narrow winding roads, and frozen terrain complicated every maneuver. Delayed resupply, and forced units to contend with frostbite, illness, and mechanical failure, all while under the constant threat of Allied artillery, airstrikes, and counterattacks. Villages that had briefly fallen to German control became fortified positions for the Allies, who used the landscape to channel and contain attacks, establish defensive perimeters, and isolate pockets of resistance, transforming a battlefield that had seemed to favor surprise and audacity into one in which methodical preparation, adaptability, and numerical superiority dictated the terms of engagement. Civilians, whose lives had been disrupted by the chaos of sudden occupation and shelling, witnessed both the terror and the human cost of combat. As towns changed hands, artillery thundered through forests and villages, and the relentless winter imposed its own cruel constraints on survival and movement. Despite the remarkable tenacity displayed by German soldiers, including improvised tactics, disguised vehicles, and temporary exploitation of weakly defended sectors, the inability to sustain operations against a reinforced and resupplied opponent became increasingly apparent. The loss of mobility, compounded by fuel shortages, destroyed armored vehicles, and severed communication lines, meant that even localized successes could not be exploited to achieve strategic breakthroughs. Individual acts of heroism and tactical ingenuity, though notable, could not offset the overwhelming structural disadvantages faced by the Germans, as Allied air superiority, artillery coverage, and coordinated counteroffensives consistently disrupted attempts to regain initiative. The battle became a grinding test of endurance, where the cumulative effect of casualties, material losses, and operational exhaustion forced German commanders to concede ground, slow their operations, and eventually withdraw in the face of unrelenting pressure. On the Allied side, the combination of strategic foresight, logistical depth, and the integration of combined arms operations ensured that the offensive could be contained and ultimately defeated. The resilience of American and British forces, operating under extreme conditions, exemplified the discipline, training, and adaptability that had been cultivated over years of combat in Europe, while the timely arrival of reinforcements and the restoration of air operations provided critical advantages in both mobility and firepower. General Patton's maneuver warfare, in particular, demonstrated the decisive impact of flexible, rapid, and coordinated action, allowing Allied forces to regain lost terrain, relieve encircled units, and impose a tempo of operations that German forces were increasingly unable to match. The ability of the Allies to integrate infantry, armor, artillery, and air assets in a synchronized manner turned the tide of battle, demonstrating that operational coherence and the effective use of combined resources could decisively overcome the initial advantages of surprise and audacity. By the end of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had effectively concluded, with German forces reduced to a fraction of their original strength and Allied forces firmly in control of the Ardennes region. The staggering casualties and the destruction of armored vehicles underscored the futility of Hitler's gamble, while the successful containment and counteroffensive by the Allies highlighted the decisive importance of preparation, coordination, and adaptability in modern warfare. The battle left a lasting imprint on the soldiers who fought there, the civilians who endured its horrors, and the strategic trajectory of the Western Front, demonstrating that even the most ambitious and daring military operations can be undone by logistical failure. exhaustion, and the superior resources of a determined and well-coordinated opponent. The story of the Battle of the Bulge, with its extraordinary human cost, dramatic reversals, and ultimate Allied triumph, stands as a powerful testament to resilience, strategic insight, and the relentless interplay of planning, resources, and circumstance that defines the outcome of warfare, reminding us that courage and perseverance, when combined with coordination and effective leadership, can overcome even the most audacious attempts at disruption and conquest. As we reflect on the Battle of the Bulge, it becomes clear that this brutal winter campaign was far more than a clash of armies. It was a stark illustration of the immense consequences of war, the limits of human endurance, and the critical importance of preparation, strategy, and resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges. The Ardennes, once forested region in Belgium, was transformed into a theater of intense conflict, where frozen ground, snow-laden trees, and narrow, treacherous roads shaped every decision and every movement, forcing soldiers on both sides to confront the harsh realities of combat under extreme conditions. The battle demonstrated that success in warfare relies not solely on ambition or surprise, but on careful planning. Logistical strength, adaptability, and the capacity to sustain operations under relentless pressure, and the stark contrast between the resource-rich Allies and the overextended German forces made these lessons painfully evident. For the soldiers on the front lines, the human cost was profound. German troops, driven by a sense of duty and loyalty to a failing regime, faced freezing temperatures, exhaustion, and mounting casualties, with entire divisions immobilized by destroyed tanks, severed supply lines, and relentless counterattacks. Many would not survive the harsh winter, and those who did carried scars both physical and psychological that would last a lifetime. Allied forces, though better supplied and reinforced, also endured unimaginable hardships, engaging in close-quarter combat in dense forests, battling the elements, and witnessing the suffering of comrades and civilians alike. Tales of courage, improvisation, and determination emerged from every sector, highlighting the extraordinary resilience of ordinary individuals who faced extraordinary circumstances, and reminding us that behind every strategic maneuver lies the human element. Men and women who risked life and limb to defend, survive, and prevail. The battle also underscored the importance of strategy and preparation. Hitler's last gamble, though audacious, faltered because it underestimated the Allied capacity for rapid adaptation. Logistical coordination and sustained counteroffensive action. The Allies' ability to quickly mobilize reinforcements, leverage air superiority, and execute well-coordinated maneuvers turned the tide, illustrating that operational coherence, planning, and adaptability are as vital to victory as courage and determination on the battlefield. The Ardennes offensive showed that even brilliant tactical ideas can fail if they are not supported by sufficient resources. Clear communication, and a realistic understanding of terrain and enemy capabilities, reinforcing a lesson that has resonated through military history. Strategy is only as effective as the structures, logistics, and people that bring it to life. Beyond the military lessons, the Battle of the Bulge left a lasting impact on civilians caught in the conflict. Towns and villages that were occupied, shelled, or retaken experienced devastation, displacement, and the terror of combat in their streets and homes. Civilians witnessed atrocities, struggled to survive in freezing conditions, and endured the uncertainty of which army would control their homes from one day to the next. Their stories remind us that war is never a contained event. Its repercussions ripple through communities, leaving deep, lasting scars long after the fighting ends. The human cost, both among soldiers and civilians, remains a sobering reminder that every military campaign carries consequences that extend far beyond maps and strategy tables. Touching lives in ways that cannot be fully measured. As we bring the story of the Battle of the Bulge to a close, it is important to recognize that this campaign exemplifies resilience in the face of adversity, the interplay of strategy and resourcefulness, and the profound human toll of warfare. The lessons learned extend far beyond the Ardennes, offering insights into leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the essential value of preparation and adaptability. For the soldiers who fought, the civilians who endured, and the commanders who planned and executed each maneuver, the battle left an indelible mark, a testament to both the capacity for courage and the cost of miscalculation. Thank you so much for watching and joining us on this journey through one of the most pivotal battles of the Second World War. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more in-depth historical accounts, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content. Your support helps us continue sharing the remarkable stories of history, providing insight, perspective, and remembrance for the events that shaped our world. From all of us here, we wish you a peaceful and restful night. Sleep well, and may the lessons of history inspire courage, wisdom, and resilience in your own life.